Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Polytalks Environment, and today we will be discussing a relevant topic, which is the 2023 State of the Union Address, specifically President Biden's speech. And for some important background, if you do not know, the State of the Union is essentially a constitutionally mandated address that occurs typically every year of a president's tenure, not included their first year. And this speech tends to often be a partisan debacle in many ways, based on reactions or certain remarks made by the incumbent president, and it's an important way to analyze the current scenes of American politics. And although it is not the most significant event of the year, today we will just be debriefing and taking a look at 5 of the largest takeaways from this State of the Union address. So we'll dive right on in here. And this happened yesterday. And of course, one of the main headlines is partisan feuds between President Biden specifically and Republicans, and this is not a new thing for the past few years, such as during President Trump's State of the Union addresses. Of course, there was much partisan posturing and disagreements with Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi famously ripping Donald Trump's speech. And, of course, for many of President Trump's remarks, the entire Republican conference clapped while Democrats remained silent, and that is largely a mirror image of what is occurring during this State of the Union address. So, of course, there was a battle between Republicans and Democrats figuratively, although things at times got very animated. And while Biden did make remarks about unity, it's very clear from the way this Congress has already began that there will be no such thing as unity, and that this will be largely a grating Congress highlighted by interpartisan feuds and battles and disagreements and gridlock. And that is an early indication of how this Congress will come to be characterized, with a Republican House and a Democrat Senate and presidency. But not only did Democrats feud with Republicans and engage in verbal debates or nonverbal debates, they also did engage in verbal debates, as seen by this section here. One of the other takeaways is it was a very raucous and lively session with many out loud disagreements. Now, this is actually a way in which this speech has broken precedent, because in the past, Joe Wilson of South Carolina, a representative, received a lot of criticism after shouting "You lie" to then President Barack Obama. And that was a sign of how this was generally seen as what is supposed to be a respected presidential speech. But there was no such pretense this time, as Republicans often heckled Biden at many points in the speech, attempted to accuse him of lying, and this was simply a show of how partisan, divided, and gridlock defined this Congress has become and will become, and that really polarization has been driven to such an extreme where really there is not even any precedent or form of politeness or civility within these chambers. So that is another key takeaway summed up in layman's terms. We can see "it's your fault" is a very ad hominem attack and a characteristic of perhaps a Congress that is focused mainly on partisan disagreements and tribalism, i.e. blaming the other side, rather than actual legislation. And that is not a partisan thing. This has happened in multiple Congresses in a row, but it's really all coming to a head now, where it's really impossible for both sides to sit down and listen to the other's perspective for even an hour. And of course, there was also an emotional moment over Tyre Nichols, who was killed by police, and this was an emotional moment for Biden to diverge a little from politics and for there to be a rare moment of solace and silence within this chamber as Biden commemorated this person and discussed how terrifying and it is for African Americans to and other people of color to get pulled over by police, and what are some common steps that may be taken in order to decrease the risk of a harmful encounter. So that was another extremely emotional moment that occurred during the speech, and I think this was a nice departure from the partisan back and forth attacks that characterized much of the speech, and a moment for Biden to regroup and really express his emotions on such a tragic event. So that was another takeaway, and it really deserves its own talking point. But another thing, of course, more in the vein of politics this time, moving back in, is Biden actually was quite an effective speaker for the State of the Union address, and he was able to ensnare Republicans in a trap on Medicare and Social Security that made them kind of twist against their own views, or Biden really was able to manipulate their response and reaction to be able to characterize Republicans' views towards Social Security in his favor. Now, what I mean by that is essentially Biden lightly accused or suggested that Republicans were keen to end Social Security or put it on sunset, as is congressional language for such an end. And this is in reference to a plan from Senator Rick Scott, Florida, which called for this federal legislation to lapse. Now, understandably, both parties dislike being the target of straw man arguments. And of course, this is very similar because Biden was essentially blaming the entire party for separate legislation. And so Republicans were obviously very discontent with this, and they led a very strong response against this statement. But then Biden was able to say, okay, well, I can see you're clearly very opposed to an end in Social Security, so keeping it will not be a problem. And of course, some Republicans do, in fact, want to reform or amend the program, which puts them in an awkward position because they appeared as if they were strongly opposed to having it lapse, when in reality they might prefer a lighter form of amendment. So that was another interesting moment in the speech, and kind of an instance of how Biden is still quite an effective politician, an effective president, and an effective speech giver. Not necessarily from a partisan standpoint, but while of course he has been really blamed for being senile and having these instances of gaffes and other similar issues, this speech was an example of how he can speak effectively on certain issues. And the final takeaway is from Republicans' response to the State of the Union. This is another annual tradition, is the opposing party will give a response from a particular figure towards the State of the Union. This time it was Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was recently elected I believe the first female governor of Arkansas. And this was a significant response, as she remarked how she was the youngest governor in the nation, actually, whereas Biden is 80 and is the oldest president in American history, both of which are true and valid points. And this is another instance of how Biden will really have to reconcile the fact of his advanced age if he wants to contend with another 2024 campaign, because yet another reminder, Joe Biden will be 86 by the end of his second term, should he win re-election, and that should be very concerning to Biden and the Democrats, because clearly this isn't also just a partisan idea, it's also something that many Democrats fear as well. And I think Biden will potentially struggle with that, although for sure I do not expect him to face any even close to meaningful primary opposition. But Huckabee was a impassioned voice for the Republican Party and a great candidate for their response, and really decried Biden and the Democrats and did not hold back, similar to how we saw how Republicans did not hold back in line with earlier conventions for respect in this chamber and the State of the Union address. So, this is another example of how Republicans are full on launching personal attacks against Biden, although, of course, in all fairness, this did happen 4 years earlier to President Trump, and it's impossible to overstate that this is a trend that is becoming more and more apparent and pronounced recently as polarization increases, and that really personal attacks and all pretenses dropped, attacks and transgressions against opposing party. These are becoming more and more commonplace nowadays and perhaps even expected of parties. So, with that, I would like to conclude my analysis of the State of the Union address. Ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, I do not believe it is one of the greatest political events of the year, but I see it rather as not so much of an event to alter the timeline of American politics, but more so a sample of its current state. And if I had to summarize, make one takeaway for all the takeaways, would be that this address was merely a sign of how partisanship is becoming more and more defined as polarization increases within this country. And that is something that has major political impacts for a few years to come and will really affect the future of American politics in the modern times. So I thank you for listening, and I hope that I may see you soon for another political analysis. Thank you very much. Goodbye.